Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to today's IGC event, Data, Technology, and E-Waste Management. The webinar is organized into two segments. We will first start with a segment on data and technology, and then the second segment will focus on e-waste management. I'm Amna Mahmood, Policy Economist at the International Growth Center. Before we get started, let's go over a few housekeeping items. All attendees have been muted to minimize background noise. We're going to have a designated time at the end of the panel discussions for audience questions. So please type in your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. Please make sure to include your full name and organizational affiliation. We're recording today's webinar, and a video and audio recording will be made available on IGC's website. We also have live interpretation for this event in Arabic and Portuguese. Finally, I'd like to point out that there will be a brief survey immediately following today's presentation. So please take a minute to fill that out, as your feedback is very important to us. Let's start now by diving into the first segment, data and technology. According to the latest statistics available, electricity access deficits are increasingly concentrated in fragile and conflict-affected settings, with the majority of the 675 million people without electricity access globally living in countries affected by fragility and conflict. At current trends, the global electricity access deficit will be concentrated primarily in these countries by 2030. Off-grid systems such as solar mini-grids are a viable option to bring electricity to most communities that remain unelectrified. However, scaling up mini-grid development in these settings face a number of challenges. One of them is being able to accurately identify where these unelectrified and underserved communities exist and what their current and future demand is, so electrification planning can be better targeted. Recent innovations in data collection methods and tools, such as geospatial analysis, artificial intelligence, and machine learning, has supported planners in developing national electrification plans by reducing both the time and the cost needed to conduct such an exercise. Moreover, technological advances in solar mini-grid equipment, such as smart meters and smart inverters, and the increasing availability of digital solutions such as mobile money has improved operational efficiency, allowing mini-grid developers to make data-driven and more informed decisions. This webinar is part of a work stream of the IGC's State Fragility Initiative, focused on scaling up investments in solar mini-grids in fragile and conflict-affected contexts, and this work is being funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. So I'd like to welcome our expert panelists here to discuss the opportunities as well as the constraints of using data and technology for solar mini-grid sector in fragile and conflict-affected settings. We have with us Reja Amatia, who is the co-founder and chief operation officer of Wea Energy. Welcome, Reja. And we have Kyle Hamilton, who is the senior manager of strategy and partnerships at Nuru, a private solar mini-grid company in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So welcome to you as well, Kyle. I'll be putting a question or two to each of our speakers before we move on to a general discussion. I'd like to first start with Reja, who is the co-founder of Wea Energy. Wea Energy has advised governments around the world and worked with international organizations such as the World Bank on national level electrification planning and providing solutions that apply new technologies and system design that incorporate renewable generation and storage options into traditional electricity systems. Reja, you have been looking at data for electrification planning for more than a decade. Can you start us off with how the data and the analysis of that data has evolved over the years, and also talk about the reference electrification model that you have developed at Wea? Over to you, Reja.
Thank you, Amna. Hello, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to be in the panel to discuss about the data and evolution of data, specifically related to the planning exercise that we have been doing at Wea Energy, initially from MIT at Massachusetts Institute of Technology and IIT Community University as a research project about 15 years ago. I would like to start off the conversation by sharing a brief description of the model that we have been using, as well as the importance of data in that model. And as anyone could be aware regarding these kind of modeling and simulation activities, the outcome from these kind of models is as good as the data that we put in. Can everybody see my screen? Is this visible, or should I make it in a full Okay, I think that's probably much better. Okay, so as Amna mentioned, we have been primarily doing geospatial electrification planning for more than 20 plus countries in the past 7 years. Just to give you a little bit of context of where this electrification planning aspect comes from. Initially, back in 2012, 2013, when we looked at this issue, what was predominant in terms of electrification planning was a much more traditional and conventional master planning route, primarily focused on grid extensions and grid expansions done by utilities. And just to showcase an idea of the type of data that was available, and I'll talk a little bit more about this specific data, the lack of data, especially the digitization of the data, and how difficult and challenging it was in order to create these kind of plans. Where we are from that 15 years ago is more on the GIS, geospatial-based planning, and the optimization-based planning. And just to showcase the snapshots, Rwanda was one of the first countries that we did the planning back in 2018, when the original grid infrastructure of the country only provided for 20% electrification for the entire nation. Again, as Amna mentioned, because of both the evolution in these kind of planning practices and the data availability, the granularity, and the clarification in terms of the data, we have been able to make this progression, which both decreases the overall time it takes to do these kind of optimization, as well as the money required. And majority of the cost at the beginning is in terms of data gathering, data processing. Just to give you a snapshot, we have in-house built this reference electrification model, again, which is a geospatial-based tool, primarily focusing on creating the least cost electrification plans and designs, mostly for larger regions on a national scale with the universal energy access in mind. There is a whole host of data that we need to feed into the model in order to get an outcome like this on a geospatial platform. I will just give a brief snapshot of a couple of the data and how it has evolved over time. One of the key things that we start off with is knowing where the customers are. Where are the unelectrified populations who need access? And as Amna said, again, that is one of the critical questions for many of the providers, be it off-grid developers and even utilities, to know where to extend their system, where to provide these services. And our model in that context is fairly unique in terms of we start with looking at individual customers, where the customers are. And the reason we start off with this high level of granularity is so that we can make the electrification systems. Is it grid expansion through medium voltage and low voltage expansion, or should it be isolated systems or mini grid systems as the least cost option? Just to walk you through the evolution of data in terms of this particular parameter, back in 2015, 2016, when we started, there wasn't a good data identifying where the customers are. We started off by, as everyone, majority of the researchers in this field, looking at machine learning and artificial intelligence in terms of identifying rooftops, building footprints. This is just a showcase of the snapshot from our own research as how incrementally better it has gotten in terms of identifying the buildings. Again, on top of that, there is data sets such as population density that does not necessarily identify the location of the buildings, but tells you where the people are. So that actually gives you a context of where the electricity demand is going to be. And based on those population density map, one could deduce where the demand nodes are. And from this back in 2015, 2016, where we are today, the context of regarding especially building footprints, because now this is the standard that we use in majority of our practices. from research entities, both within the likes of Google and Microsoft, have made these kind of building footprints data available for across the world. And it works fairly well in terms of both the urban areas as well as rural areas, specific focus on rural areas where there is the lack of access. And just showing some of the snapshots of the data that we have actually used. And there is information regarding the confidence level, the area footprint, the building footprint itself that allows one to deduce information such as, could this be a residential building? Could this be an animal shed? Could this be a large non-residential load such as either schools, hospitals? So things that we can deduce with combining with other informations in this regards. The other key information, the data that we use in terms of planning exercise, is knowing where the grid infrastructure is. And in this particular case, kind of going back to this map that I had showcased earlier, this was actually our own experience in one of the utilities in India, where it was a map. We took pictures and we actually digitized them. This was back in 2012, 2013, when the utilities did not actually know their own infrastructure assets, where they were. Luckily for us, there has been huge progression in terms of the data availability. Again, an example of a utility having the correct and accurate information regarding their assets, where the high voltage lines are medium voltage lines, down to poles, transformers, and even some of the countries have information about the electrical meters. So it's the customer location that they have. And laying on top of this, information such as nighttime light satellite images allows us to then accurately measure the electrification rate, as well as the potential of where the electrified communities are versus unelectrified communities, which may not showcase nightlight data or would not have the grid infrastructure. And for them, that's where we do the electrification planning. Just one other type of information that could be critical, that is critical in terms of the electrification planning exercise, topography, or knowing where there could be natural reserves or forbidden areas that, for example, in this context, you may not want to build the electrical lines in. Just showing progression of feeding the model without the information of this, in this particular case, a lake, it would do the least cost option, the shortest route in terms of connecting the communities. Whereas if you give and provide the information about having these kind of natural reserves or constraints, the model can actually then draw a much more realistic network, providing you a more realistic optimal option solution of electrifying and providing technology for these communities. Just a snapshot of quick example of the outcome from these kind of modeling exercises. Again, as I mentioned, because now we are able to do it at a building level, one can get these kind of reference networks so that one is able to get a much more realistic design of, in this case, a mini grid. Similarly, a grid expansion as well, if there is a grid nearby. So that's what the geospatial planning allows one to do. Kind of wrapping it up with the context, specifically in more conflict-prone regions, I would say the methodology in this context, especially for the planning exercise, is still the same. We have done this, we have applied this methodology. In this case, it was in the Lake Chad and Sahel region. We have done similar analysis in places like Haiti, for example, where it's not just the host community or the local communities, but looking at how a potential displaced population or refugee camps over time would get some permanence, and how one thinks about electrification solutions for them. One thing I would like to mention at this point, especially from the planning exercise perspective, we are technology agnostic. It's not like we are promoting either grid expansions or mini grid systems or off-grid systems in that context. Given the regional or the local context, the technology, especially, for example, in this context, it may be more towards things like solar kits, solar mesh systems, and more of easily movable as solutions as well. So that's something that the model can take into consideration given the constraints of the local environment. And with that, I would like to end my presentation and happy to take any questions or now or later as we move along in this discussion. Thank you, Amna.
Thank you, Rita, for that excellent presentation and then also walking us through the data journey and electrification planning over the years. So again, excellent. I would like to now turn to Kyle from Nuru, who has more than 12 years of experience leading social research, private sector, and public policy projects in the DRC. Just to give you a bit of a context of the challenges in the electricity sector in DRC, it only has 21% of the country connected, and increasing access to electricity is a national priority, but the financing required exceeds the government's fiscal capacity. The electricity sector was liberalized in 2014, granting private players like Nuru the right to operate in the market. And Nuru currently has 4 operational sites within an additional 2 under development. So Kyle, you've been with Nuru, you've helped Nuru scale from 1 solar mini grid serving 40 customers to a planned 6 mini grids serving more than 20,000 customers. Can you please talk about how Nuru uses data for site identification, system planning, and operationalizing their sites?
Yeah, thank you, Amna, and great to be here with everyone. So Nuru, we were really focused on financing, building, and operating mini grids in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And trying to do this work is often challenging because we're using and trying to rely on multiple sources of data to identify new sites. But beyond kind of the data, we're having to do broader analyses around regulatory landscape, looking at competitor analysis, market assessment, and all that goes into how we assess the viability of a new site. But to speak on the data and technology side, I think one of the big challenges in operating in fragile, conflict-affected settings like Congo is a lack of data, a lack of access to data that we can use. That means we're having to draw on multiple sources, both primary and secondary sources of data, to and often imperfect sources of data in order to assess a new market. And so we're asking questions like, okay, how much weight should we give to different data sources and estimating demand and potential for a new market, how to size a site. One of the key things that we do when we go into a market, we do some surveys with households and small, medium enterprises and social institutions just to get a better understanding of the community and what their energy current consumption is and how they're getting their energy, if at all, what they're looking for moving forward. And we also have, one-to-one meetings with key leaders and stakeholders in the community from large businesses to governments to really understand who the needs in the community. And so, for example, we'll put together a list of large potential clients, whether they're businesses or hospitals, and we'll go there and we'll take these data loggers. These are tools that we can hook up to their diesel genset, for example, if they're using a diesel genset currently, to understand their actual kilowatt hour consumption on a daily basis, and looking at kind of their load profile, so how they're consuming energy and over the course of a day, to really understand what their current energy needs are, and then have some conversations around what their future needs are. Maybe they have machines or tools that they're currently not powering because they don't have sufficient energy supply, or they can't afford what's available in the market. What do they plan to do moving forward? And we take that aggregate level data across all of our large clients, and we try to size our new sites to sell 50% of our system output to these large clients. And these large clients really serve as an anchor load, which then enable us to provide energy access at scale to smaller customers, households, small, medium enterprises, and some smaller social institutions like schools or small healthcare facilities. So really trying to draw on this data logging that we've done with these large clients to to then go and look at the retail. The retail is a lot more challenging. What Reja was just showing, I thought was wonderful and excellent, and those kinds of solutions are the direction that we're moving in, to look at rooftop analysis. So we've done more rudimentary rooftop analysis in the past than what Reja just showed, and we're hoping to use new tools to improve what we're doing. But one of the key things that we've done when we go into new markets now is drawing on existing data that we have and trying to look at rooftop analysis and compare the rooftops that with the customers that we're currently powering, to leverage the current data that we have, the consumption data from our current existing customers, to apply that and connect that to similar rooftops in new markets, so that we can begin to look at, okay, what are the densities, where's the potential demand? And we do that in relation to the kind of the layout of all of the large clients we plan to supply and provide energy access to, that 50% load that I was talking about that we captured through data logging. And that enables us then to kind of assess where might be the right pathway for us to build this distribution network. And so we try to use existing data as best that we can, in combination with other data sources, whether it's population data from NGOs or research that has been done in the area, or it's some healthcare related data that we're able to get from the government. And we try to use all of these tools, primary and secondary, to determine potential demand and how to design and optimize the system so that we can reach 100% utilization of the system as soon as possible, demonstrate the commercial financial viability of the new site to our investors, and make these projects investor ready and friendly.
Thank you, Kyle. I think that was very useful and very insightful, and I'm sure the audience would have benefited from that information. I think another thing that I think would be very useful if you could share your thoughts on is, we've observed that over the years, solar mini grid sector has benefited also from technological innovation in equipment and components, as well as digital solutions. Can you talk a bit about the technology and the digital solutions you employ at Nuru, and how these have improved operational efficiency and reduced costs for the company? And also, it'd be useful if you could touch upon any challenges with adopting these solutions that you face in a market like the DRC.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, there have been a number of exciting opportunities and challenges to try to build greenfield, brand new infrastructure in markets that don't have it. And also to try to drive innovation in the space that we're operating in DRC. So yeah, we use a lot of different technological and data sources to do what we do, and optimize and improve efficiency, and provide world-class energy service. That's our goal. So we use traditional tools that you'd find at many utilities, like a supervisory control and data acquisition, a SCADA solution, which allows you to kind of pull in data from many different sources to monitor and control the energy being dispatched to customers, and to analyze what's going on in real time with our systems and our customers. And that brings in everything from our PV, our solar-based energy, to our diesel-based energy, and looking at the metering data and just monitoring and controlling everything together. We use a CRM tool, so a customer relation management tool, to track all of our customers and to map where they are, and in relation to the whole distribution network and infrastructure that we have. We use that to communicate with customers and send out text messages as well, and about both scheduled maintenance or unscheduled maintenance. We have smart meters, so meters that are connected and communicate with us through GSM-based technology that enables us to track everything with our customers and their consumption, and automate payments. And really, that I want to focus on payments and the smart meters, because that's been one of the great challenges, but also an area where we've been able to, I would say, improve the lives of our customers, but also create a lot of efficiencies for us as a business. So if you look at mobile money use in Congo relative to regional neighbors, Congo has a lower use of mobile money use. And so this was a kind of a challenge for us because we really wanted to create a cashless operation that would minimize any potential challenges for us as a company, but also create a lot of efficiencies and hopefully reduce friction for our customers as they're paying. But this was for most of our customers, this was a brand new thing. So having to work with them, educate them, provide them with training so they could do it themselves, if they felt comfortable using mobile money payments to pay for their electricity services, or to use a local kiosk where they could go and have somebody do it for them. So basically, we had to work with mobile network operators to get this set up. We had to do a lot of programming ourselves to make everything work and automate everything on the back end to ensure kind of a smooth transition from payment to getting electricity any time of day for our customers. And so that wasn't anything that was immediately operational. We had to kind of build that in-house and kind of work with mobile network operators, which was also a challenge, just because, at the time, and we're still like a growing company, and we were kind of a small fish. And so it took time to get on the radar of the mobile network operators to get the integrations that we needed in order to provide the kind of quality of service that we wanted for our customers, connecting and automating the process from payment to electrification any time of day. And so that's something that we've really continued to work on and improve. Another challenge has just been finding the right metering solution that works at the densities that we're operating at. So we have, for example, over 2,500 customers in one site, our largest site, and in close proximity. And just the way the technology of the meters, there was some communication challenges between the meters and some of the nodes. And so we've had to kind of work through that with the metering company to try to find solutions and co-create a new way of doing things with them that work for us, especially as you mentioned, now we're planning to scale. We're going to grow from our current base of 2,900 customers and hoping to grow to 20,000 customers here through 2026. And so navigating all of these different technological questions, data questions, has been paramount for us as we've been trying to grow and scale as a company in a very challenging market where there are armed groups, where there have been volcanic eruptions, et cetera. So it's definitely been interesting and never boring.
Wonderful. No, thank you so much, Kyle, for sharing that information. So what I'll do is I'll open up the discussion for just general questions that I will pose to Rita, you and Kyle, and feel free to unmute yourself when you want to respond. So I think, I'll start with trying to understand a bit more, what are the challenges that continue to remain that have not yet been addressed? And what are the lessons that have been learned with respect to using data for electrification planning, especially in a fragile and conflict-affected setting? What messaging would you want to give to policymakers, let's say, who are involved in this kind of work in the sector?
Thank you, Amna. So regarding the biggest challenge, I would say, which I didn't get to touch upon, is the dynamic nature of the region itself, especially in the conflict setting. And it could be both political as well as from the natural disaster as well, right? So how do we capture that dynamism in terms of when doing the planning activity? Just to give you the context, the example that I showcased in terms of displaced population, that community, it grows, expands, and can decrease depending on how the population is moving. So how can one capture that? Versus something like an example that we did for electrification plan in Haiti, it's a natural disaster. A hurricane during the season can come in and wipe out the infrastructure. So how do you take that into account? And that's where, both from the technology perspective as well as decision makers in the ministry, the policies around it, where the exercise can help is by providing scenarios what if questions. And that's where these kind of planning tools, I feel like, can support the best, is by answering what if questions. What if the demand grows? What if the population increases? How does that change the technology setting? I would say, a more conventional, traditional communities or region, the trend that we see, for example, as the demand grows, it's more towards grid infrastructure, the permanency of grid infrastructure. Something, for example, we saw in Rwanda. As I said, when we started off, it was 20% electrified country. Now it's moving closer inch towards 60, 70% electrification. And majority of them has thanks to the stability of the country and the growing infrastructure, right? So that's the type of, if that wasn't the case, given the mountainous terrain and all of that taken into consideration, there is still a huge potential for off-grid systems, individual systems, or mini-grid systems. So that's what we try to provide an insight when we work with government, is these what if scenarios. It's not just one case and this is the least cost plan. There are multiple ways to get to that 100% electrification rate. It's the context of the ground that's important, that's critical, and that can change over time. Even in the short duration, as I say, most of the countries now trying to get to that 2030 universal access goal. Within the next 5 years, as things change, how can these kind of electrification planning exercises help and support along the way? And one thing I would throw out is, don't take this planning exercise as a one-time and done deal. You have a plan and this is what you follow through. We work with governments year in, specifically to capture those variations and how does that change and modify the even the technology mix, right? Depending on if there is new resource or new technology that comes in, that should be taken into consideration 2 years down the line, and not be strict with, oh, this community was supposed to be grid and grid is the only solution.
Perfect. Kyle, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, so I really agree with what Ray just said, and just would say that I would love to see policymakers, whether within country or other countries, trying to support, or donors or investors trying to support these new emerging markets, and especially these conflict-affected communities like Congo. One of the ways I could see that being really helpful is helping us get more data. So we're talking about data, we're talking about technology, but I think, like I mentioned, there's really a dearth of data on these new markets. And in DRC, we're seeing, when we're on the ground, we're seeing demand anywhere from rural to peri-urban to urban settings. Even in urban settings where there is some energy access, it's often very unreliable and insufficient. So there's just a huge need for more data, really understanding like the market context. So DRC hasn't had a census since, well, I was born. And we could really benefit from having, market profiles of especially large urban areas that are underserved with energy. And so I could just see that being a really important way that policymakers could support businesses like Niru and others, anyone making it open source data that everyone could benefit from, not just energy companies, but anyone trying to provide a solution to serve a population. So I think that is a critical missing piece that I want to highlight right now.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kyle. I'm just mindful of the time. We need to move on to the second segment, although we do have a few questions which we can take up in the Q&A session following the second segment. So again, thank you to our wonderful panelists. I will now hand over to my colleague, Helen, to moderate the next segment on e-waste management. Thank you.
So hi everyone, and welcome to the second half of today's ITC event, How to Mitigate the Impact of E-Waste in Fragile Settings. I am Helen Donna, Policy Economist at the State Fertility Initiative based at the International Growth Center. So as was mentioned previously, we're going to have a designated time at the end of the panel to discuss to answer any questions. So please type in your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. And please make sure to include your full name and the name of your organization. So 675 million people worldwide have no access to electricity. The majority of them live in countries classified as fragile by the OECD. The World Bank estimated that 210,000 additional mini-grids would be needed by 2030 to reach a universal electricity access. This raises the question of what will happen to all those mini-grids and the expanding use of electronic and electrical equipment once they reach their end of life and become what is commonly known as e-waste. So to begin with, let us clarify what we mean by e-waste. Put very simply, electronic waste, or e-waste, refers to any parts of an item that contains electrical equipment and that is disposed of by their users without the intention of reuse. So globally, e-waste is the fastest growing waste stream. The Global E-Waste Monitor of 2024 estimated that the world generated 62 billion kilograms of e-waste in 2022. While fragile countries only represent a tiny fraction of that waste, this is only going to increase as electricity access expands. This is cause for concern. Electronic equipment contains hazardous materials, such as lead, mercury, cadmium, and nickel. If improperly disposed of, these minerals leak into the environment, where they have been found to have detrimental effects on the health of communities living nearby. As an example, lead, which is found in some types of batteries, is particularly toxic to young children. High levels of exposure affect the neurological development of the child, causing intellectual disabilities and behavioral issues. The severity of lead exposure has led the World Health Organization to declare that there are no safe levels of lead exposure for children. These materials found in electronic equipment are also valuable. The International Renewable Energy Agency, or IRENA, estimates that the value of recovered materials from solar panels alone could exceed $15 billion by 2050. So the hazardous nature and potential value of e-waste imply it should be treated as a separate waste stream, with the infrastructure necessary to collect, store, recycle, and dispose of e-waste properly. Building this infrastructure is a difficult task. In most fragile settings, there is currently little or no infrastructure to dispose of e-waste properly, and building it will take time and a lot of financial resources which fragile countries have little to spare. Moreover, as countries struggle to expand access to electricity, e-waste is understandably not the priority of either developers or policymakers at the moment. However, the fact that mini-grids and electronic equipment more generally are not yet widely diffused in these markets is an asset that should be utilized. Developers and manufacturers have an opportunity to design, repair, and maintain their equipment in a way that minimizes e-waste in the long run. So to discuss these issues, I'd like to welcome our expert panelists here to discuss what can be done on the ground by local actors, developers, and by governments to mitigate the impact of e-waste. Amy Jenks is a desk officer at the Global Platform for Action, TPA, working on sustainable energy in displacement settings. And Julia Yatani is an assistant program officer at the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, or UNITA, working in the Green Development and Climate Change Program Unit. Her work falls under the Sustainable Cycles Program, which develops forward-thinking solutions to address the challenges of e-waste. So I will be putting a question or two to each of our speakers before we move on to a general discussion. The final 20 minutes will be dedicated to answering your own questions on either the data or the e-waste section of the webinar. So I would like to start by hearing from Amy, who has worked on the topic of sustainable energy in displacement settings for the past 8 years, both at the global level and on the field, managing different projects. So Amy, could you tell us what are the main challenges concerning e-waste in displacement settings?
Yes, and hello everyone. Thank you for the chance to speak on this topic. I'm just going to share my screen briefly. So we have a few visuals. Is it coming through? Great. You should be able to see my screen, yeah?
Yeah, I can see.
Great, great. Yes, and yeah, thank you for the introduction. So I've had the pleasure of kind of supporting a global task force, actually looking at e-waste and displacement settings with a colleague as well within the GPA team, and then also to actually set up an e-waste take-back and recycling scheme last year in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh. So I'll speak from those two spaces. But more from a general overview, I've come up with kind of 6 main challenges and have some photos as well to have some visuals. I would say the first one is that general waste management processes in displacement settings are usually quite underdeveloped. Usually humanitarian response is not completely funded, and so I think waste management is always a challenge. And then e-waste comes as a subset of waste management, which is even more complicated to process. So I would say the general waste management systems are not really set up correctly, and then and actually need much more support. So then when you add on the topic of electronic waste, it's even more complicated in a displacement setting. Secondly, a lot of the hosting countries which are hosting refugee IDP settlements are not always having e-waste recycling services. And I think we'll hear from our colleague at Unitar a little bit more about the broader policies and regulations around e-waste in different countries. But most displaced people are in lower middle income countries that might not have this wider infrastructure for e-waste take back and recycling setup. I would point to GOGLA, which is actually the Global Off-Grid Solar Forum. They do have a whole working group around circularity and e-waste, and they do have very interesting resources on that. So that is one resource. But of course, if you don't have an e-waste recycler in country, then you might need to transport that e-waste cross-border for disposal and recycling, which gets costly and expensive. Thirdly, I would say it's very difficult to make these business models sustainable. So of course, I think refugee settings or displacement settings in general aren't sustainable to run, period. But then actually adding on the whole e-waste component, usually energy is not even a priority within humanitarian settings. So there's not much funding coming to the topic. So again, looking at e-waste as a niche topic, it usually would require funding that is not there. It is interesting that the value of the metals in the e-waste can basically sometimes cover the disposal costs. We experienced that in Bangladesh, actually. So actually those e-waste disposal costs, if there is e-waste recycling in country, can be kind of lessened based on the value of the metals in the e-waste. So that was quite an interesting lesson. But overall, it's quite difficult to make those models sustainable. And then fourthly, I think there's quite a disconnect between the electricity suppliers and the end users. So often when humanitarian actors distribute either solar lanterns or set up mini grids or solar streetlights, they usually do it through a typical public procurement and then a distribution model. And then the service providers, so say it's an electricity or an energy lantern provider, then they don't actually have access to the context to set up those repair processes. And so usually that disconnect, I think, leads to the possibility of basically when those products break down, them becoming e-waste instead of having local repair processes set up. I would also say there's quite a variety of e-waste. So actually in the project last year, we came in thinking, we're going to support solar lantern repair. But then once we did a market assessment, we saw that it's actually lights, fans, batteries, solar panels, so many different electronic products that need repair, which then leads to the final points around needing separate repair processes and spare parts for those repair. And so, yeah, it just is inevitable that those electronic products end up becoming e-waste if all of those different repair processes are not covered. I will say there's a lot of local knowledge. I saw a lot of the Rohingya refugees actually having a lot of local knowledge on how to repair the process, the different types of e-waste. There's many smaller informal shops in and around the camps. So it is there. It's just this kind of lack of formal spare parts and tools. It is always a need to set up local repair. And then finally, actually, there's quite a lack of awareness of the harmful effects of e-waste, which I think we heard at the beginning. I think we did an entry market survey and asked people if they know about e-waste, and most people said no. Of course, they have electronic waste in their home, whether it be cables or panels or whichever, which you can see on the screen. But yeah, usually they were holding on to that because they perceived that it was valuable, and they also didn't know the potential harmful health effects that it could have if they, kept it in their home for many years, or dumped it into the environment. So there was a lot of work around doing community awareness and actually awareness building around those effects of e-waste.
Thanks a lot, Amy. That was very interesting. Thank you for talking us through all the different challenges. My next question to you is, what activities should actors, either in government or on the ground, undertake to mitigate the impact of e-waste?
Yeah, thank you. I think we can look in kind of 4 buckets. So if we look more upstream at the products themselves, on the design and procurement side, we always encourage manufacturers to design products that are more durable and repairable. So on the solar lantern side, for instance, we've seen a Norwegian company called Bright Products that actually provides a lot of solar lanterns in displacement settings. And they have intentionally prepared or designed their new products to be very easily repairable and recyclable. So upstream on the design side, that's always what we encourage, which I think is also a challenge throughout the wider industry. Also making sure that products are meeting end users' needs. Of course, if the end users are not liking the products, then it's very quickly that they could become e-waste. So just ensuring that the need is clearly scoped and the products provided are meeting those needs. And then we've also worked with some of our partners within the UN and NGOs to set higher procurement standards. So when they do their long-term agreements, for instance, with solar providers, whether that be for solar lanterns or mini grids or whichever kind of infrastructure, to really make sure they're getting the quality products and services. On the repair and reuse side, going back, it's really around improving access to spare parts and tools, and also providing training to local communities on how to actually do those repairs. We did that in Bangladesh, actually, set up a hub where basically it was essentially an e-waste repair shop, where the refugees there learned how to do mini grid repair, solar lantern repair, street light repair, etc. And then that knowledge was really locally absorbed, and they were also able to then repair the infrastructure in their communities. And then on the collection and storage side, again, as I was saying previously, I think it's a lot around raising awareness around e-waste, its harmful effects, and then how or what to recycle. Setting up safe storage spaces. A lot of displacement settings are quite far from capitals or from locations that actually might have e-waste recycling companies set up. And so setting up local safe storage spaces and following international standards there, as well as incentivizing e-waste take back. So something we did in the project last year was really to look at, what are people valuing the current e-waste at, and how can we give a very small cash stipend to them get that e-waste back and then dispose of it properly through an e-waste recycler, which leads to the last point around recycling. So actually before doing the final recycling is actually kind of taking apart whichever products make sense to and using those as spare parts where it's possible. And then also partnering with e-waste recycling companies and making sure they have the ability to actually bring the e-waste that is collected near or around a displacement setting, and then make sure it gets to the e-waste recycling company. So there was actually one based, I think, 9 hours from where the camps in Bangladesh were, and we partnered with the e-waste recycling company, and they came, loaded the e-waste into their transport, brought it to the capital, and then were able to dispose of the e-waste from there. And maybe just to give a bit of a visual image, on the left, there's a picture of the different e-waste products that were collected in one of the refugee camps. So you can see a lot of solar panels, fans, cables, lights, chargers. You can see some funny old boom boxes, which were really fun to see that people really actually valued these products, even though they were from 10, 20 years ago. And then on the right, that picture is a training around solar home system repair and maintenance. And so yeah, that was done in Kutupalong refugee camp, and quite an interesting experience and pilots. Again, all subsidized by public funding, so that was probably one of the major challenges to keep that going. And then just quickly here's like a kind of map of the different e-waste programs and displacement settings, spanning across Uganda, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Bangladesh. And we have a link on our website, which has access to all of this information as well, if anyone wants to learn more. And finally, that's just an overview of the different reports that have recently come out. So there is a small but growing knowledge base around the topic, if anyone is interested to dive in more. Thanks.
Thank you, Amy. That was very insightful. I would now like to turn to Julia, who has worked with UNITAR on e-waste issues. As part of her work, she has engaged with governments to build standardized data sets on e-waste. She has also advised governments on how to build their e-waste management capacity. So, Julia, my first question to you is that one of the key problems with e-waste is that a lot of countries lack the data to quantify the problem. There is little information available to governments about the quantity or the type of e-waste located within their borders. So how should governments start gathering data on e-waste?
Thank you, Ellen, for the introduction, and thanks also for the invitation and the opportunity to speak as a panelist in this webinar. You touched upon a very important issue. In my view, measuring e-waste is fundamental because in general, to deal with a problem, you first need to know and to understand its magnitude. As you correctly said at the beginning, in your introduction, e-waste is the fastest growing waste stream that we are facing. And many countries worldwide are lacking the capacity to produce e-waste data and statistics, and this makes the problem even more difficult to monitor and to quantify. And having bad data causes bad information, and bad information brings bad or knowledge-led framework at all as a consequence. So having the knowledge and the capacity to produce e-waste statistics and data means in a way to start addressing the e-waste challenge, because it allows to evaluate the developments over time, to set and assess proper targets, to identify best practices in policies, priority also for policymakers, and to allocate adequate financial resources. It also is the basis for the SDGs reporting in a way, especially for the SDG 11 and 12 indicators related to waste. And in addition, when this data is produced according to an internationally harmonized methodology, it also allows comparability among different countries. Good data helps in adding more facts into the debate, in my view. Well, to measure e-waste in a country, we need first to quantify the amount of electrical and electronic equipment which is sold basically each year on the market in this given country. And then you should consider the average lifespan, which is also the functioning time, we can call it, of the equipment. In this way, we are able to estimate when, statistically speaking, in which year all those items will become waste. And we can therefore think about building a time series on the amount of e-waste generated each year in a given country. And this is, let's say, the bare minimum. But then you can also investigate how much of that e-waste is being collected and hopefully recycled, how much is exported abroad, for instance, how much is mixed with other type of waste and goes likely to be landfilled or incinerated, and how much cannot be traced and it's lost in the chain. This is the so-called gap. So if you then compare the amount of e-waste generated annually and the amount which is formally collected by a management system of a country, you get an idea of the country e-waste management system and performance with the collection rate. These indicators, this concept requires a good reporting scheme and good data available, and this is not always the case, unfortunately. So as a consequence, e-waste quantification always requires a lot of research, a combination of many data sources, and a good methodology to harmonize all of them. But this methodology exists, And if you're interested in this methodology and on the indicators that can be used to measure e-waste, you can find all this information in this e-waste statistic guidelines, which is a publication that my team has written in 2018, and that is now under revision to be updated also. This is available online, but I can also share with you as resources for after this webinar. And this publication really lays the basis for the harmonized methodology on e-waste statistics, which is also recognized and applied internationally by many countries worldwide already. So in practice, countries should integrate mandatory data reporting and monitoring into their national or regional e-waste legislation system. The monitoring system should also cover annual statistics, as I mentioned, on the amount of electrical and electronic equipment which is sold in a country and on the e-waste generated, as well also on the e-waste collection and treatment. And this must be based preferably on an internationally recognized classification system, such as, for example, the 6 e-waste categories that we have in the WE Directive, but there are also other classifications worldwide available. And in addition, import and export statistics of e-waste needs also to be compiled. And this is currently done through the Basic Convention on the control of transboundary movement of hazardous waste and their disposal. But this is not sufficiently applied at country level. So this could be another point of action for governments. Besides the harmonized methodology for e-waste statistics, another powerful tool, in my view, to start obtaining and producing e-waste data in a country that doesn't have mandatory reporting yet in place are surveys. They can be done at a household and business level. They are quite easy to be developed. They are very useful to understand e-waste generation and disposal trends in the population, as well as also the average consumer behavior. Let's say, in surveys, you can ask, for instance, how many equipment have been disposed in a certain time frame that you want to look at, of which type and with which modality. And you can get strong insights with not too much effort, let's say. If you allow me also to add on this point, improving the global picture on e-waste data is one of the main activity of my team. Which really has the objective to improve the quality of e-waste statistics worldwide and to build national capacity, raise awareness, and also communicate key waste data to the general public and to the relevant stakeholders. And actually, given that many countries lack this official measurement system of e-waste, with the project that we are realizing, we try to combine investigation from our side as well as trainings for the country, so that from one hand, we try to fill a data gap, and then we publish reports such as the Global E-Waste Monitor 2024. And from the other end, we also train the countries in a way that they become independent and able to produce their own official e-waste statistics for now and for the future also. So we have already conducted many workshops in several regions worldwide. And during this workshop, we try to help even more directly the governments in making this standardized data set on e-waste through this harmonized methodology, through some data sources that we can provide, and also practical tools that we have developed. They are based on Excel to make them as user-friendly as possible, and they can help the user to start quantifying and producing e-waste statistics. These tools, as I was mentioning, start from the concept of the amount of electrical and electronic equipment placed on the market, and then considering the lifespan of the different type of equipment is able to generate this time series that I was referring at the beginning. So they are very easy to use. They are available online now for the EU27 member states in relation with the WE Directive, but we can tailor them for basically any countries in the world. And that's a very easy tool to use that really can help governments and countries' focal points to, or experts to start building their own e-waste statistics in an harmonized way. So that's something that I can also provide in case someone is interested for the after webinar resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. My second question is, so as long as governments do not regulate e-waste, any efforts to tackle this issue is likely to be limited in scale. So given that you've worked with government to build that capacity, what's your advice on where should policymakers that want to regulate e-waste start?
Thank you. So you're right, the regulatory tools are very important because if you don't have a legislation, not only legislation, but at a certain point also an infrastructure in place, only informal, partial, and substandards recycling can take place. So in my view, the adoption of an extended producer responsibility, the EPR scheme, is probably a very relevant step, where the products producer or manufacturers is considered responsible for the e-waste arising from the products that they are producing. And the producers has the legal obligation to take back the products at the end of life stage and to guarantee its proper disposal. What happens in practice is that the consumers pays for the end-of-life management of the products, and this happens either through an advanced recycling fee on purchases or a recycling, inexplicitly recycling disposal fee. And this extended producer responsibility is not perfect, but presents an effective approach to e-waste management. And in absence of a system like this, with a formal financial flows that is sustains, then cherry picking becomes rampant. And what happens is that only the valuable material is normally selected for treatment, with the rest of the e-waste, especially the hazardous fraction, being dumped. In a formal system, the fees generated for e-waste management through the EPR should cover most of the valuable fractions recovery, but also the hazardous and non-valuable fractions management at the same time. Besides this, in my view, effective e-waste legislation should enlist a clear definition of what electric and electronic waste means and is, and the classification for ease of identification and monitoring. There are a lot of discussions still ongoing, even in Europe under the WEEE directive that is there since 20 years, about which products are falling into the scope or not. So there's no full clarity on this. To monitor collection, countries should also introduce a legal obligation on e-waste collectors and processors to report and record the amounts and destination of all the types of input and output fractions in their facility. And in this sense, the enforcement should also accompany this monitoring through inspection and annual enforcement plans, involving the different actors in the compliance chain. Another aspect, in my view, is the implementation of the mandatory e-waste environmental health and safety standards at the collection and treatment plants. This should be done also while increasing the awareness and the compliance of all the actors involved. And again, also here envisioning monitoring and enforcing mechanism to be applied regularly. Then, as I mentioned in my previous answer, another point is the transboundary movement of e-waste, which are now controlled and reported under the Basic Convention. But unfortunately, that is not strictly applied in terms of reporting obligation by the countries who are part of it. So an improvement of these reporting requirements would also help in preventing e-waste illegal trafficking in the end. And then there are other two regulatory tools that I would like to mention briefly. One is the all actors approach. They are maybe a bit more advanced, but I think conceptually they can be mentioned, and the mandatory handover. The all actors approach is a policy model which includes all natural and legal persons that have legal responsibilities in the e-waste management chain, including those that are really handling the e-waste from a collection, logistic, refurbishment, preparation for reuse, and recycling point of view, but also monitoring e-waste, legislating e-waste, and enforcing e-waste legislation. And what this principle says is that all actors are obligated to abide by the national legislation and work toward the common goal of responsible e-waste operation and transparent monitoring. Then the exact implementation can vary from country to country, but the main idea behind is that managing e-waste must be a shared responsibility. And last, the mandatory handover of e-waste to licensed facility. In this policy model, retailers or waste collectors have the obligation to hand over the collected e-waste to compliant recyclers and to certify this, or to formal take-back systems also. And this can occur with or without a financial compensation accompanying. I think that's all that I have in mind from the legislative and regulatory point of view. But if there are any questions, happy to explore further. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. That was, very insightful. I think you covered, it was a good introduction to all the different regulatory tools. So now we're going to move on to the more general discussion. So I will address those questions to both you, Amy, and Julia. So whichever one of you want to answer first, please do. So I think one of the key issues of e-waste management is cost. There's a fundamental trade-off between funding more mini-grids, for example, versus tackling e-waste. Given the constraints that fragile settings face, is e-waste management feasible? And what strategies can governments adopt to mitigate the worst impact of e-waste despite those financial constraints?
I can go first briefly. And then, Julia, I think maybe from the wider government side. I would say it's, it's all about kind of prevention and how you implement. And so especially in an IDP camp or a refugee camp, they're usually a bit disconnected as well from the national context. So when mini grids or when solar streetlights or lanterns are being put in place to really ensure that the e-waste, at least like the local repairs are covered from the start. And so then you don't have as much e-waste being generated. So I think there's, that's on the prevention side. And then I think the whole extended producer responsibility discussion would be very interesting to bring into the humanitarian sector as well. If suppliers could, we've talked about like a green tax or something when we are procuring different energy solutions, if those could be somehow also in the overall costs of implementation. And basically being able to be managed. What often happens is within the first 1 or 2 years, systems there'll be a 1 or 2 year warranty because that's the budget availability within humanitarian responses. They don't see past 1 or 2 years in terms of budgeting, and so longer term O&M and recycling is just not ever really foreseen. So I would say more having foresight whenever making sure implementation happens with that e-waste in mind from the start, and then continuing budgeting for it throughout the life cycle.
I can also compliment. Thanks, Amy. And just to complement on another point that was not mentioned, in my view, is also it's true that financially there are a lot of stumbling blocks in the e-waste chain, but I would like to mention also the aspect of the regional collaboration. As you can imagine, e-waste recycling is a quite long and complex process, and in most cases it implies more steps and plans even to be involved. And it can happen that some plans are not available in a country A, but there are in a country B, which is not far. So legal, authorized transboundary movements of e-waste where processing and treatment capacity is available could also help optimizing their management. So countries could enable shipments of recovered materials to expert and processor facilities in the region or elsewhere in neighboring country, where the overall recovery can happen in the most efficient and state-of-the-art way. There is a case, for example, in the United Arab Emirates, where there is this big hub which is functioning as recycling plants for almost all the Middle East countries. So, and this is one. Another point, in my view, is the global community. The global community should limit the burden in developing countries and conflicted areas in fragile settings, and should build capacity, transfer knowledge and technologies, ensuring enforcement and the application of certain type of legislation. So we see a lot of these second-hand flows coming from the for example, from Europe, from the Americas. And this is not per se bad because we are giving a second life to the equipment that still works and in a way that someone else can also benefit from it. But it will become bad as many of those countries that are receiving our second-hand goods don't have the capacity to treat those equipment once they stop functioning. And in this way, also the original producers is losing their responsibility on it. So this should be prevented as well. And then, of course, there are innovative technologies, both from the production side and also from the recycling point of view to minimize e-waste generation. But what I also notice is that the stumbling block once an e-waste has been generated is really the separated collection, meaning that most of the e-waste doesn't even get the chance to be properly recycled besides the cost. So that's where I think also there is more room for improvement. And for what concerns technological improvement to reduce e-waste generation, then I totally second what Amy mentioned, that most lays also in the production phase. We need products that last longer, that are more easily repairable. The eco-design principles are driving towards this reparability and modularity directions, but also in Europe, they're still not so often applied by producers and manufacturers, although the guidelines are there already. And also, in my view, improving the communication and the transparency between the production and the recycling fields could help, as most of the time, recycling is difficult due to miniaturization and materials which are embedded together and processed that are really difficult to interpret from another part of the e-waste chain. Thank you.
Thank you to both. That was very interesting. I think we've run out of time to ask another question, but I think we'll move on to the Q&A section. So I'll just ask the panelists from the data section, Kyle and Reja, to please turn on their videos. And I'll ask a few questions to first Kyle and Reja, and then I'll go back to Julia and Amy for a couple of questions on e-waste. So on data, we know that the availability of a large amount of data is great for improving the accuracy of predictions and forecasting, but it also raises questions on data privacy and protection. So what do you think should be done to ensure the protection of this data, which can be critical in fragile and conflict-affected settings?
Thank you, Helen. Maybe I can take a stab at that question. So it is very critical, and that has actually been one of the challenge for us when we advocate for transparency in terms of at least from our analysis and results being brought to a larger platform. That has been one of the holding, I would say, the blocks that does not allow for, let's say, the full publication of the work that we have done. And it's also always a tussle between the government entities, how much to disclose. As Kyle actually mentioned, it would be great for the developers to actually have that information. It can be utilized in much more nuanced context, regional level information. But there is, from, let's say, the top-down aspect, I think data privacy and that has been one of the critical aspects holding back governments from releasing this information, at least from our experience and interaction with them. Just to give you context, when we did the electrification analysis in Pakistan, the infrastructure, it was very critical and important for us to know where the infrastructure is, but it's also highly sensitive information in many parts of the country. So it's always that challenge. What we, during our simulation analysis, of course, there's lots of, even from the technical perspective, ways to mask the data so that at least the right information, the results, the baseline messaging can come across to a bigger public outreach. If not to a general public, at least make some kind of consortium, especially with developers coming in, so that they're aware of what has been done on the large scale analysis. Because as you said, I think from the a large-scale perspective, we have seen a big leap and bound increment in terms of what kind of data is available, and it's only going forward. Now there is a huge resource and interest in terms of understanding demand, right? Again, on the large scale, not just taking into consideration where the customers are and what overlaying it with information. What Kyle is actually trying to do is, with his own limited but small data set of what the current customers are using, there is data around the utility, what the utilities customer are using, historic data. And that's something when we do a project, we have purview to it to understand how demand growth can happen. And it is challenging in terms of the level of information to make it open to public. But I would say one way is more of a collaborative effort to bring at least consortium or key stakeholders, decision makers, and also the implementers to know about this. And that's something that could be done from the governance perspective as well. So it's not only, there's because of this data, in some ways, masking of data, there is that sometimes divide that we see between the top-down large-scale electrification planning and the bottom-up, the grassroots movement that the developers are doing by providing access in these communities at individual customer level. But again, to emphasize the point, there is, technically, from the technical perspective, there are ways how surveys are done, and you can mask the customers and clients' information, security enhancement in terms of making sure that data is protected. So those things have to be taken into consideration, but also with the intent and objective of trying to provide that knowledge or disseminate that information to a wider audience. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I think for us, we really try to protect our customers' data as much as we can. So keeping it secure on our servers and not only providing access to those that need to have access to that data. I think another aspect of it is anytime we're capturing survey data, for example, we always ask for their consent, and we commit to keeping their data confidential. And the only context in which data and actually would only be something like geolocation data would be shared would be with a partner that we sign an NDA with, and it's for a limited legitimate business purpose to try to improve energy services or to help us assess the possibilities for a new site development. But we would never share their name, other kinds of details. But that's probably as sensitive as it gets for us in terms of trying to navigate that. So it has to be something that really benefits the broader community that we're trying to serve, and that's really the goal. And when we do share data, in terms of public data, we just provide aggregate level data, and so it's not exposing anyone's particular details and data as well. So we try to limit any kind of data sharing that we do internally and externally, and try to do so with appropriate protection and benefit to the community.
Thank you to both. I'll ask you another question before we move on to the e-waste section. How do you think that governments in the countries that you work in can help with facilitating the use of data for electrification planning?
So I would say from our experience, maybe the government, I'm kind of keeping all the big stakeholders in one bucket. For us, for example, the utility, having consistent digitized information about their resources has been a huge help in terms of doing these kind of planning, especially because if you don't know where the electricity infrastructure is, you don't know where the access is. So that has been one of our very key baseline assumption moving forward with doing the planning exercise. And in that context, the push has come from either the supporting actors such as the DFIs, pushing for these technologies to be embedded in the workings of utilities so that it needs to be digitized. And it's also moving along with the pace in terms of where technology is. So that's one. And regarding the infrastructure data. And then the second one is embracing the, at least from our perspective, the geospatial information, because earlier it used to be there is the geospatial information that we try to overlap with something like a census data, but now there is geotagging in that as well. So that actually helps in many ways correlate multiple of these data sources, either to cross-check each other or actually, as Kyle said, as a primary source and a secondary source that actually supports and makes sure that the data that there's a high level of confidence with the data that we have. So in many ways, there is consensus being built around, and that does come from the high level push and influence.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned before, I really think governments have a key role, both in terms of facilitating financing to support data collection and, developing reports with other partnerships, whether it's the World Bank or development finance institutions, embassies, because I think there's a real need for just more information about what's needed, what the demand is, and integrating tools and data and inputs from groups like WEA and the Energy Access Explorer, and we need all of those resources, and those resources cost money, and so we need governments to mobilize their own resources, and when they don't have it, trying to facilitate opportunities to engage with other external partners to fund that work, because that is a huge work and would benefit not just Nuru, but the whole ecosystem of actors trying to provide services, utility services and other services in these communities that need them.
Thank you so much to both. Now turning back to e-waste, we have a question from Sarah Logan, IGC Tanzania. So how difficult is it to separate out critical minerals in, for example, solar equipment or e-waste in general, to be able to recycle it for other manufacture? And how feasible is it for this capacity to be built out in more fragile contexts?
Maybe start, and then Amy, if you want, you can complement, of course. It is complex, that's true, because as I was mentioning, e-waste recycling entails a long chain of events and different steps. You normally start with a sorted collection, and then you have a pre-treatment phase. You can have dismantling that can happen either manually or mechanically, and then you have primary treatment, the secondary treatment, and the final hand processing, where especially the valuable components, the metals, can be smelted and put back into the economy. So that's complex, that's true, but especially for the first steps of the chain, there are steps that can be applied also in countries without having enormous technological investments, energy investments, especially the phase of the collection, sorting, manual dismantling until the primary treatment. They are environmentally and economically efficient. And especially manual dismantling is better than mechanical dismantling and allows to reach higher performance, higher recycling efficiency and recycling rate. Because mechanical dismantling requires advanced technology, high energy consumption, and high investment costs, which you don't need in the manual dismantling. So countries, that's why I was mentioning that the regional collaboration could be beneficial in this regard, because the first steps of the management chain can be applied easily, basically everywhere. And then countries could enable shipments of these recovered materials to expert and processor facilities in the region, in the neighborhood country, where the overall recovery of the valuable materials can be done in an efficient way. This approach would also allow to utilize in the best way the already existing infrastructure regionally, and somehow also be the most economically viable for the country's recovery stream. Side effect, this labor-intensive manual dismantling could be implemented locally, providing also job opportunities through low technological investments. That's what I wanted to say. Amy, if you want.
No, maybe just to echo that point around regional collaboration, it's really essential that is connected. If there's not those type of recycling capacities in country, then being able to make sure that can happen is very important. Yeah, and I think also the point around like just small inputs at the local level, people know or have ideas of what the value of e-waste is, and they have knowledge around what to do with it. So I think kind of understanding that and understanding how some quite low cost inputs could then be put at the front of the process to be able to do that locally, and then see, you know, what's needed on the more formal recycling side. Thanks.
Thank you. I think we just have enough time for one more question, very briefly before I close. So just on this, many countries have an informal recycling sector that already recycles part of the e-waste. So can you say a little bit briefly how that sector can be leveraged to build the e-waste recycling infrastructure necessary to dispose of e-waste safely? Either one of you, yeah. Perfect.
Yeah, yeah, it's very interesting and context specific, I think, but I think it's really about understanding what that informal system looks like. So just one example of what we did last year was understanding what people are valuing the price of their e-waste. And then we kind of equated that to a small cash incentive to then get them to give us back their e-waste. And so and then we got a lot of very interesting insights around the kind of informal scrap dealers that would go near and around the refugee camps to then, you know, buy the metals, and actually how sometimes they, you know, they were using kind of lead acid batteries. So because there was no environmental standards, sometimes they would just pour out the liquid into the environment, which is really unhealthy. And then actually once we started collecting it, then we were able to actually engage with that local ecosystem and share knowledge about what to do and how to formalize. So yeah, I do think it's very, very context specific. Julia, you might have more from a bigger global perspective. But yeah, I think really understanding those informal systems first and then knowing how to best input is very important.
Yes, thanks. That's correct. The informal sector is active basically in any country at different level. And unfortunately, it's very difficult to get clear data on it, how much is active, where is active, and it's very difficult to map. But it's very interesting also to hear from Hemi how this could be engaged from a ground perspective. It's true that it should be better involved, and this can be done through proper incentives. They are already kind of doing a job, part of the recycling job, collection and recycling job. So any country and any formal system would just benefit in try to engage it as much as possible, because a lot of people are already collecting this waste, maybe without the right means, without the proper techniques, but they should be involved and equipped also with the minimum proper tools to really doing the job that they are doing, and with the right sort of incentives if that's available, also to ensure that they can make out a better living by doing a better job in the recycling business as they are already informally doing. By ignoring this part of the informal sector, countries would be missing the opportunity of collecting and recycling more waste and getting back more recycled materials into the economy. And as I was mentioning before, especially for the first stages of the treatment process, there are steps and actions that also the people from the informal sector could definitely do without having to engage high technological or energy investments, especially for the sorted collection and for the dismantling part. So there is definitely room where the informal sector could be engaged once you get a good contact point with it and the right proper incentives too. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm very conscious of time, so I think let us stop there, even though I would love to ask you many more questions, because this was really interesting. So we've addressed two very important questions today: how data can be leveraged to effectively plan and design a mini-grid, and how can the negative impact of e-waste be mitigated. I want to give a big thanks to our speakers. It has been really interesting to hear you speak about all those important topics. I also want to thank the audience. I'd like to remind you that there will be a brief survey immediately following today's presentation, so please take a few minutes to fill that out, as your feedback is very important to us. Please look at our website for the toolkits and case studies on data and e-waste, which are to be published next month. And we will be hosting our final webinar next Wednesday. The topic will be on creating the right enabling environment for mini-grids. So please do register. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, colleagues.
Bye.